Right, so I think as it's 5 o'clock here and noon your time, I think we'll make a start.
Okay.
So good evening, everyone, and good morning to you, Professor Jentleson. So my name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy-related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Bruce Jentleson of Duke University, where he is the William Preston Pugh Distinguished Professor of Public Policy. Professor Jentleson is one of those academics whose list of publications, academic appointments, public service, public engagements, and so on is quite literally so long that it would take me the full hour just to get to half of them. But I will mention a few recent highlights. So in 2020, he was the Desmond Ball Visiting Professor at the Australia National University. In 2015 to 2016, he was the Henry Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress. In 2014, he was a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he's now a Global Fellow. Among his many earlier research appointments included the Brookings Institution, the U.S. Institute of Peace, IISS. He was a Fulbright Senior Research Scholar here in Spain, and I also noticed your association with the Changing Character of War program at Oxford, which I was once associated with myself. In addition to his academic career, Professor Jentleson has also served in the U.S. State Department during the Clinton and Obama administrations, as well as serving as a senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore in the 2000 presidential campaign. Among his many books, his most recently published one is The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship. Earlier works included American Foreign Policy, The Dynamics of Choice in the 21st Century, and Perspectives on American Foreign Policy, Readings and Cases. His forthcoming book is entitled Economic Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know, which according to the Oxford University Press website will be out as of next June, priced at a remarkably reasonable £12.99. So I'm definitely planning to order my copy in advance before the price goes up. Anyway, rather than continue any further, I think I'll stop there. So Professor Jentleson, welcome back to eBay, sadly again virtually. And I look forward very much to your presentation this evening on Biden's foreign policy first-year assessment.
Well, thanks very much to Dr. Michaels for the invitation and the very kind introduction. It's wonderful to engage with all of you. We can do a lot of things with Zoom, although we cannot do the Vino y Tapas, so I'll take a rain check on that. I was supposed to be in residence at eBay in spring of 2020 for about 6 weeks, and that got COVIDed out. And I look forward to an opportunity at some point to come back to eBay in Barcelona and to Spain. Now, I want to balance the lecture part and time for questions and discussion. So I'm not going to cover every possible issue, but I'm happy to address issues that may be on your minds when we get to that part. But I want to provide sort of a strategic framework rather than just a laundry list for how we think about the Biden foreign policy and the U.S. global role, and then specific issues that illustrate those aspects. You can refer to my homepage for other things that I've written. And as Jeff said, I'll speak from my work as a scholar also and professor, but also among the policy and political roles that I've had, serving in various roles in Washington and U.S. foreign policy. So the main message for much of the first year of the Biden administration has been America is back, as well as from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, all of whom are folks I've worked with and have been colleagues for a long time and have great respect for. We heard it in June during the trip to Europe at the G7 summit, the NATO summit, the EU trip. We're hearing it again this week in Rome at G20 and up in Glasgow. Very much the sense that America's back from Trumpism. There are still tensions and conflicts with allies. France and the so-called AUKUS, the nuclear submarine deal with Australia and the UK, has been a major example of that. A lot of criticisms of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, how it was done. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So there are definitely tensions, but these are very different than what I call Trump's 3 Ps. The personal insults of leaders, Chancellor Angela Merkel, the incident where he elbowed his way into a NATO picture, and I think it was the head of Montenegro that he pushed to the side. Very personal with Trump. Policy. He fundamentally didn't believe in alliances or partnerships. And that aspect was very different than issues in which we've had disputes. Disputes with the United States and Europe go way back. Even during the Cold War, we had a number of them, as well as we're having today. But the personal, the policy, and the politics, the ways in which Trumpianism directly and indirectly fed into some of the movements of concern in Spain and elsewhere in Europe, very right-wing populism, and autocratic leaders like Putin and Bolsonaro in Brazil and Erdogan and others. That personal, policy, and political were unique to Trump. And the message from President Biden, who has long-term relationships with Europe, many leaders, has been America's back. And that's been okay to get us started. But the question that we now have is back to what? And what is the U.S. role in its relations with Europe and more broadly globally now that we're back? And here, I think, in the same way, I have a penchant for alliteration in English. So we have the 3 Ps for Trump. We have the 2 Rs for Biden. That his foreign policy really has been torn between restorationism, going back to a U.S. role as it was before Trump, world leader, liberal order, a variety of aspects like that, and recalibration, less on the way the world was, but a role for the United States globally that's more geared to the geopolitical, economic, technological, and other dynamics that we have in this 3rd decade of the 21st century. In my view, as I'll articulate, the policy needs to continue to move towards this latter, less restorationism and more recalibration. There's been some elements there, but I think that's where it needs to continue to move. So there's some compliments here and some criticisms for this first year of the Biden foreign policy. Excuse me, restorationism. All the talk about U.S. leadership. If you Google the word leadership or you word search for leadership, it's like in every speech. And we all know, and I did write a book, as Dr. Michaels mentioned, on leadership lessons from the 20th century, leaders from a variety, not just U.S., that made major breakthroughs in global affairs. It's the liberal order, it's democracy versus autocracy. And we see this in a number of aspects. Much of it is about the U.S., the Atlantic Alliance. President Biden's first trip and his second trip, in fact, his only foreign trip so far, have been to Europe in June, and then this trip to Rome and now to Glasgow, to emphasize the commonalities that we continue to have with our European allies. A second part of the restorationism is approaching the China threat akin to the way we dealt with the Soviet threat during the Cold War. And some are said to be even greater. President Biden, in his speech to Congress that was sort of equivalent to the State of the Union earlier in 2021, talked about who wins the 21st century, them or us, China or us. It's been active also in Asia. We've been emphasizing more our Asian alliances as well. But there is this sense of kind of like a new Cold War with China that is not restoring to the old Cold War, but is the same sort of mindset that there's a single enemy adversary around which we need to organize. Third, with Russia, we still have differences, but it's very different than Trump, which was this, incredible embrace of Putin. President Putin and President Biden have had a dialogue already, a virtual dialogue. And here we are, as we often have with Russia, having both our differences and our commonalities. Right away, the countries agreed to work on the next version of START, the Strategic Nuclear Arms Control. And there have been stories about below the radar, quietly, different working groups between Moscow and the United States. At the same time that there are plenty of differences over cyber and Ukraine and a variety of other issues. But this is in some ways restoring to the way we've dealt with the Soviet Union and Russia before. more multilateralist, this administration. Right away rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, expressed an interest in getting the Iran so-called JCPOA, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, going again. Blinken just made a trip to Latin America, which was rare during the Trump administration by secretaries of state. We have the USAID, the Agency for International Development, under Ambassador Samantha Power, who was a very strong leader for that. And greater emphasis on human rights. There's an upcoming summit for democracy, December 9th and 10th, which I'll talk about more in a second. I think the main break with restorationism so far has been Afghanistan, where, as we all know, the United States withdrew. My own view on that, I put it in a nutshell, has been as the right decision, but very poorly implemented, and poorly implemented in ways that were foreseeable prior to that. I gave a number of press interviews, did a podcast with Chuck Todd of NBC on this while it was going on. Things that were knowable and plannable in the run-up. And I'll leave that there for there. If people want to elaborate on that, we can come back to that. The problem with restorationism is some policies were not working that well before Trump. Think about it. You know, within NATO and the Atlantic Alliance, we had a number of tensions. The military intervention in Libya in 2011 really split NATO and included Britain and France and the United States, but not every member, unlike other NATO actions in the past. The Iraq War in 2003, to go back to the Bush administration, were rather major differences within NATO. We also had seen the limits of American leverage over allies. You know, the notion that somehow the U.S. as global leader before Trump, were able to get our way with Pakistan over Osama bin Laden and over Pakistan support for the Taliban, over Israel that strongly opposed the Iran nuclear agreement and Obama administration efforts to get the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks going, with Saudi Arabia, also very opposed to the Iran nuclear agreement, and then some differences over Yemen. Post 9/11, in terms of this restorationism, our counterterrorism efforts as they related to democracy and human rights, define democracy as what I would call ABT, anybody but a terrorist, which led us to support Morsi in General Sisi in Egypt, and others. It was a little bit like during the Cold War, we said we defined democracy as ABC, anybody but a communist, which led us to support all sorts of dictators and military juntas in Latin America and the like. So there was a tension there between democracy and human rights values and counterterrorism. The Paris Climate Accord, the reality is, while the United States withdrew under Trump, as we see now in Glasgow, that very few countries lived up to the commitments that were made. So while the United States supported that, its capacity to be a solution or a big part of a solution for our climate change issue was very limited. So restorationism can't go back. Glasgow COP26 can't go back to Paris because that didn't work very well. We're going to have to do better and more. And the list goes on. And moreover, I would say that if we look at the United States record on multilateralism, going back even a little further, it's not that we always have been supportive of multilateralism. During the Clinton administration, we had a pro-internationalist president, but the naysayers still prevailed. Kept the United States out of the landmine ban treaty, kept the United States out of the International Criminal Court, kept us out of the Kyoto Protocol. So this, again, it's important to see the Trump period as particularly problematic at home as well. But this notion of somehow some role to go back to had lots of flaws in it. And moreover, the international economy was under strain long before the current issues of COVID and vaccine nationalism. Let's remember that we had a number of financial crises globally. In the early 1990s, it was the Mexican peso and the Russian ruble, and then in the late 1990s, it was the Asian financial crisis. Well, in 2007, 8, and 9, it was the American economy, Wall Street, that melted down, that had ramifications to the rest of the world. And then, of course, the Euro crisis that was part of that and followed after that. My point is that the issues that were there before Trump, there was a transition needed in America's global role, the role of others as well, that the sort of sense of how bad Trump was kind of covered that up. But if we think about it, why would we think that a particular role for the United States and various international institutions that were set up after 1945, when there was a particular distribution of power, set of issues on the agenda and the like, would necessarily fit well 3/4 of a century later? And that that order worked in a lot of ways well. It worked for containing the Soviet Union. It had a variety of other problems. But it was designed for a particular order. And if you think about that in any situation, if you're a business, you have to change your strategies as market conditions change. So there needs to be a change given the changes in the international order here in 2021, rather than just going back to the previous role. And a lot of the Biden policy has been America's back, we're back to the role we played before. Again, there's some benefits there, but some flaws. We very much need this recalibration, which, as I said, is less on the way the world was than on the geopolitical, economic, technological, and other dynamics driving this 21st century world. And we'll see some of those elements in the Biden policy, but my push is for more of those in ways that would benefit the United States and benefit the role we play globally. And let me take about 5 different issue areas and run through them a little bit. And I'm going to start with China. China is rising. It has risen to a great extent, and that's a fact. And given its size, its extraordinary economic and technological progress over recent decades, and its own history of the outside world, European colonialism, the United States, Japan in the 1930s and during World War II, exploiting it when it was weak, and its pride in its centuries-old civilization, this had to happen. Okay, and that's a given. That's the sort of the point we need to start from when thinking about relations between the West and other parts of the world and China's global role. And to China's credit, the extent to which it's developed economically and technologically in really 2-3 decades is quite historically unique. There has been over the last, say, 3-5 years, a greater concern in many countries here in Europe, and there in Europe, in Asia, and the United States, about a greater assertiveness on China's part. At the same time, countries have also talked about and felt that they continue to have interest. This is true in Asia, India, Australia, Japan, as well as in Europe. They have relations in China. If we go back and make it even more general, the way I think about the world, and this relates to why the notion of who's going to win the 21st century is fundamentally flawed. What I see in the world is what in other contexts I've been talking and writing about is what I call a geopolitical pluralism, which is basically countries in the world, whatever the region, Europe, Middle East, Latin America, Africa, Asia, want to have relations with more than one major power. This is not the Cold War where you kind of chose up teams, right? You're on one team or the other. It's very, very different. And while many countries, I think it's true of Europe, value their relations with the United States more than their relations with China, it's true when I was in Australia, as Dr. Michaels mentioned, both at the university and kind of interacting with a number of people in the government. The notion of a new Cold War and the U.S. starting to go so far as to say, let's define everything about the threat we all face with China, is very counterproductive to countries. And we've seen that some in the U.S.-European differences over the possible new investment treaty and the like. And I think at home, we also have to be very wary of threat inflation. We have a history of over and misestimating threats. It was true during the Cold War with the Soviet threat as we extended it to the so-called then Third World. Many of the major tragedies in American foreign policy, Vietnam, support for dictators in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere, had to do, I think, with an overestimation, with an inflation of the Soviet threat, and the inability to differentiate between the classic containment challenge in Europe and other aspects. Similarly, after 9/11, clearly the Iraq War was threat inflation. Staying in Afghanistan for 20 years was threat inflation. Some of our counterterrorism policies were that. And so I've been very wary about this so-called new bipartisan consensus around China and the like. Moreover, we need to ask, how is this going for you, President Xi Jinping? As China's become more assertive, it's actually made it harder for countries to maintain relations with them. You know, some examples, the UK, you know, the United States had been pushing countries during the last administration, this one, to not allow Huawei to set up the 5G. The British had actually opposed that. They wanted to go forward with Huawei, or at least exploring that as one of their options. When China cracked down on Hong Kong, which Britain has a strong relationship with, given history, that was when the conservative government said, all right, we're going to ban Huawei. That backfired. You know, I saw this in Australia too, where you know, the Chinese sanctions against Australia's actually been able to go around those, like countries often do sanctions. But that began to turn Australia away, not totally, because they've got a strong economic interest in relations with China, but made them more open to things like this new nuclear submarine agreement with the United States. The Belt and Road Initiative, some $4 trillion in this initiative, has only brought limited leverage over recipient countries. The so-called wolf warrior diplomacy has been coming across, as one person put in an article, as brazen diplomacy and rhetorical bluster. And public opinion polls in one country after another of China are much more negative than just a few years ago. In some ways, in these and other respects, China is encountering what other great powers have, including the United States, when they've overextended and bullied. And so I think that there is some need to push back on China. But I think in many respects, it is seeing the consequences of its own policy. And so one more alliteration, I had the 3 Ps for Trump and the 2 Rs of Biden foreign policy, is the 3 Cs. Confront is necessary, but only as necessary. Compete as we must, and we must in terms of technologies. Not that one technology is going to dominate the world, but that can be a healthy competition for the US and for Europe in renewable energy and in a variety of other areas. Confront and compete and cooperate as much as possible. The reality is we need to work together on key issues based on shared interests. Climate change is the biggest one. Part of the reason the Paris Climate Change Agreement came together in 2015 was the US and China deciding that we would both work together going into the Paris talks. We're not quite sure what China's position is going to be in Glasgow. Xi Jinping gave a speech to the UN, I guess in September, where he pledged to stop financing and selling new coal-fired plants around the world. Didn't quite define what new was. Is it going to, what about the existing contracts and what they're going to do at home? But the world will not resolve climate change if it becomes another issue that's the US versus China. We worked together on the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015. We need to work together on that. And so I think we need to find areas to cooperate, which we did with the Soviet Union, by the way, in the Cold War. We had strategic nuclear arms control. In the late 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, we and the Soviets worked with the World Health Organization on smallpox eradication. So I worry that the Biden administration has gotten a little too hawkish out there. We need to balance the pushback, the confront, and the compete with cooperation. That's more of a recalibration than this notion of new Cold War. Secondly is, and I've written on this as well, if you think about, if you do a threat assessment, and you ask, what's a greater threat to our security, to European, to other security in today's world? Is it China, or is it climate change and pandemics? 5 million people now have died around the world from COVID. Over 750,000 in my own country. Climate change, you know, this is no longer, as mentioned, I worked for Vice President, including Senator Al Gore, when he was beginning to do his work on climate change. People said, oh, it's going to happen someday. It is happening here and now. We have many examples of it. And the economic consequences of this are very severe. And moreover, as the private sector is discovering, you can be green and green. You know, there's a lot of money to be made in renewables and other areas. And the Biden administration has given more priority to climate change and pandemics. I think it needs to be even higher priority. It needs to be at the center of our so-called grand strategy. When President Biden came to Europe in June and emphasized China. We've been much better off if we emphasize a common position on climate change and pandemics, and not just how to continue to handle COVID, but the next pandemic, scientists tell us, is not, it's not if, but when. If you like, we talk about WMD, weapons of mass destruction. What we face here is EMD, environmental mass destruction, and PMD, pandemic mass destruction. And for all the talk of US leadership, actually there's more room for the United States to establish a recalibrated leadership role when it comes to these two issues. They fit our society and its innovativeness. They fit the size of our economy. We've been doing very poorly on both, and President Biden has gone to Glasgow without much action from Congress. We have our politics, but they're conducive to many of our societal and economic strengths. So again, it's moved in this direction. That's good in terms of recalibration. I would elevate these issues in a systematic way to be our highest priorities because they affect our security, they affect our economy. And as we've seen, they affect our daily life, our kids, our ability to be in person, and the like. So it's a second area where there's been some recalibration, but there needs to be more. Third is really the U.S. global military role. And this gets us to NATO and other regional alliances and partnerships. Before I talk about NATO, we are still way overextended. We got out of Afghanistan, but we're still in Iraq, we're still in Syria. We have special operations in over 100 countries. The new proposal that the Biden administration has made for the new defense budget, fiscal year 2022, is $753 billion, which is higher than Trump's. And Trump had increased the defense budget $100 billion. We really have to figure out ways, which is not, pulling back from the world totally, but getting a recalibrated military commitment compared to other priorities, and frankly, compared to what ways in which we're using our military capabilities and force are actually effective. Some are actually quite counter-effective. That some of our operations in Afghanistan, I think, were counterproductive. And I think it's been the same in other parts of the world. So there needs to be, a reconsideration, a recalibration of what our global military role is. In terms of Europe, I'm someone who believes that, I believe NATO has a future. I think that it has been doing a pretty good job, and I know in Madrid this summer, through their big meetings to sort of, again, recalibrate what NATO's role is going forward. Doesn't mean throw off all the other things NATO's done. NATO does face, a Russian threat that the Baltic nations and others are concerned about. So I think NATO will continue. We have enough shared interests. But in the broader sense, the EU discussion of a common foreign and security policy, and even strategic autonomy, as President Macron likes to put it, I don't see this as a threat to the United States. I actually think it is a positive, beneficial development in our overall sense of an Atlantic alliance. I would like to see Europe play a greater role in this, in terms of that. It fits with my notion of geopolitical pluralism, where we need more actors on the international stage, not just the US at the center of everything. And it can be complementary to NATO. In some ways, that to me is more significant, the diplomatic role. Just one small example. News reports are that we may be headed back to reopening Iran nuclear talks. And the process has been the Iranians talking to the EU3 on this, to Britain, France, Germany, and to the EU representative, and sending the feeler there, and then it coming back to the United States, because the Iranians didn't want to make it look like it was a concession to the United States. It's okay, we're all going to be involved in this together, but it's a good example where there's a European role that's distinct from the US. So I think that this notion of a more autonomous role for Europe can be productive. Frankly, it's up to the European Union, as you all know, to figure out how to do this and have enough internal consensus to do it. And there are a lot of concerns about that, a lot of doubts about what can be achieved. But I'd like to see it achieved. I think it's a part of the pluralism more generally. In other regions, the way I think about it is, whether it's Asia or the Middle East, some others, the U.S. needs to shift our role from what's been a security provider to a security enhancer, where we have seen ourselves as the principal provider of security in Asia, in the Middle East. And I actually think much more has to happen among the countries themselves. The so-called Quad, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, they're getting some attention. To the Biden administration's credit, these meetings have actually focused not just on the military, but on how the countries, the democracies, can work together on pandemic prevention and other issues in the region. And what's happening in the region that in some ways is more interesting are some of the bi and trilateral military exercises and the like between Japan and Australia and India and the like. So the U.S. has a role to play, but the countries in the regions need to play a much greater role, because ultimately security is about relations between those countries and in Asia, China, and also in the Middle East. And I think that, again, a small example of the Middle East, one hears from a lot of America's traditional Sunni allies, you're abandoning us. And, the reality is that, the relationships, we're not abandoning them, but we want to recalibrate the relationships for what our interests are today. Well, one positive consequence of that is the Saudis and the Iranians have actually started talking to each other, right? And it's because the Saudis are feeling like the Americans won't totally take their side. That's a good thing. So this shift in our global role, which isn't totally pulling back, but is a more limited role, not in just a burden sharing kind of way, but actually what really works best for security. Two other issues, and then I'm going to start to wrap up so we have time for question and discussion. Democracy and human rights. Better than Trump, for sure, who basically told the world he didn't care about those and did his best to put his arms around dictators around the world and autocrats. But here, too, the reality is Trump is not the only U.S. president who has not always prioritized democracy and human rights. The ABT policy, anybody but terrorists, since 9/11, which the Bush administration and then the Obama administration practiced. During the Cold War, one military dictatorship after another that we supported in Africa, Latin America, elsewhere, in the name of anti-communism. Right now, it's still largely directed at adversaries. This administration has been more critical of Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and the like. But I actually think that it's been fudging on countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Israel and the settlements, India and some of its policies, Poland and Hungary. If we're going to take democracy and human rights seriously, we actually have to realize that we can have more effect on allies and partners than we can on adversaries. There's a long history in my sanctions book. I talk about the ways in which sanctions on human rights bases in China and Russia, Navalny is the most recent case. They may feel good, but they don't really have impact, and they often can be counterproductive. And there's a lot of research on this that's there. So I think of this as sort of the Hippocratic oath on democracy and human rights, where that's, don't do harm. We can at minimum make sure that we don't add to the repressiveness of governments like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others in terms of the aid we provide and our willingness to look the other way. I don't think we can force these governments to change. I think that's unrealistic, and they have their own incentives there, but we can at least not be part of the problem. And frankly, I would like to see us do better on that, rather than just the speeches about how terrible things are in Venezuela or the like. There is a summit of democracies coming up December 9th and 10th. I've actually written with a colleague, and I'm about to write another article that we've been asked to write. Well, I don't think that's a very good idea, because I think you end up inviting countries to it. For example, Poland is on the list of invitees. At the same time, the EU is fining it €1 million a day for its violations of rule of law and the stuff and the like. And again, I want to pin that, and we can come back to that. So I think if we think about democracy and human rights, let's put more emphasis on trying not to help countries violate it than just bashing adversaries for what they do. And two last points. One is, we really think about a shared global leadership role. My point about European Union strategic autonomy and the important role that countries in the Quad are playing themselves is very much like that. Not all the best answers are made in Washington, even with an administration that I think more highly of and have great respect for the people in it. Look at COVID and the way we have handled it. If you look at the OECD, 33 of 37 social justice indicators reflect the U.S.'s, lags behind. U.S. ranks, 33rd out of 37 countries in the OECD on social justice indicators. And these reflect policies going back much further than Trump. So we want to get into more of a shared leadership role, that different countries can bring different things to the table. And going back to the Middle East, the major breakthrough in the early 1990s was done by the role of Norway in the Oslo talks, and the US had a role. And frankly, those of us in Washington tend to sometimes think we always have the best ideas, and it's not true. Last point, which in some ways everything comes back to, is making our democracy work. I cannot understate concerns about the state of American democracy. Let's be honest. January 6th, we first talked about as a riot, and we called it an insurrection. We're increasingly realizing that it was an attempted coup, an attempted golpe. There are plenty of problems in other European countries. To my knowledge, the Cortes Generales building has not been attacked violently like the way that the American Capitol was, or the Bundestag, or the EU Brussels headquarters, or wherever. The problems in American democracy run deep. There are many aspects to them. I'm concerned about where things go in the future, and there are a whole variety of things there. And our ability to get our democracy on track is going to be an absolutely huge issue for us to do anything. There too, we have a lot to learn from others. But I don't want to end on a really pessimistic note, because it's a challenge that we all have to deal with. But it's more than just Joe Biden winning the last election. And those are for it. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd love to have some questions and discussion in the remaining time, elaborate on any of these points, address some that I didn't address. But I appreciate your time and welcome the dialogue. Gracias.
Professor Jentleson, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. It was really a global tour of the Biden administration's foreign policy, the challenges it faces, its priorities, and so on. And my compliments as well for the 3 Ps, the 2 Rs, and the 3 Cs. I'm definitely going to be using those in my work as well. So at this point, we have some time for questions, just over 20 minutes, I see. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box, which you can find if you go to the lower right-hand side screen. If you click the purple icon with the 2 arrows, and once that opens up, just go to the icon on the lower left-hand side. Otherwise, you can raise your hand, and we'll arrange for you to speak. Perhaps while we wait for some questions, I might take the liberty of asking the first one. I mean, you had mentioned, at the start of your presentation, Biden's emphasis of this idea of, America is back, and back to what? 5 years ago, when Trump was elected, there seemed to be a sense for many U.S. allies, and probably many in U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy as well, that we can wait this out for 4 years, keep our heads down, cause delays maybe, and so forth, and then return to some sort of normality in 2021. On the other hand, had Trump been reelected last November, all bets would have been off. Perhaps we would have seen some more fundamental shifts, new alignments, and so on. But with the prospect of Trump returning to power in 2025, do you think this administration appreciates the difficulties of being taken seriously, especially when it comes to things like climate change or return to the nuclear deal with Iran? In other words, although Biden keeps stressing America is back, that there is a widely held view out there that the real question is America's back, but for how long?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, my sense from what was from Trumpism to what was even in the best case scenarios that Biden or somebody like him stays in power, I still believe we need to do this recalibration of foreign policy. But your point, Jeff, is like, I actually, one way to think about American politics is the way we think about international currencies, right? Where if they fluctuate within a certain zone, that's okay. And when they get out of that fluctuation zone, then it's a problem. If you think of American politics over the last quarter century, I mean, in 1998, we tried to impeach a president on some really terrible personal behavior, but it was personal behavior, impeachment. In 2000, when I was working for Vice President Gore as a foreign policy advisor, we had an election that was decided by the Supreme Court. And for me to talk about that more, I definitely need to come to Spain and have some vino, because it's a painful memory. But that was a big deal. In 2003, we go to war that many in the world disagreed with. In 2007, as I said, the financial crisis that hits the world emanates from the United States, where we've been looked to before as the engine of international growth, not the car crashing it up. In 2008, we elect an African-American president, which many in the world welcome, but talk about a swing of the pendulum. And then in 2016, we go back and elect somebody like Trump. And so the notion, and I've had people say this to me, is how do we know that you're going to stay in that currency fluctuation zone, even though Joe Biden won, which is what you're asking. And that can't be known. They're changing their efforts at the state level to change election laws to make them more oppressive. Frankly, there is more political violence being planned now as we speak, and it's sure Facebook's a part of it, but it runs deeper. There've been some historians who've written some great work on the rise of militias in the latter part of the 20th century in the United States. So there is no guarantee, which is all the more reason why other countries need to figure out what their global role is. That shared leadership aspect, that even if the United States stays around in a reliable way, not all the best ideas are made in Washington, all the other aspects I talk about recalibration. But when you look at our politics, it reinforces that. There is no guarantee. We have an election today. The one, if you're watching the news, the state of Virginia is having a governor election that's seen as some indicator of where it's going, whether the Democrat wins or the Republican who has tried to separate from Trump, but basically is connected to Trump. And that way, and Democrats have won in Virginia. So there'll be some signs there too. But even if the Democrat wins, these issues, this deep pattern over 25 years of getting outside that currency fluctuation zone is problematic.
So we have a question from Adam, who asks, Russia and China at the UN are currently trying to get sanctions removed from North Korea, or on North Korea. Do you think the Biden administration is more in favor of the carrot or stick in dealing with North Korea and sanctions? And related, might we also be seeing some good cop, bad cop from the Biden administration to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table?
Yeah, on North Korea, I'm not convinced I think they're trying to relax the sanctions in ways that help them. China's had a dilemma with Kim Jong-un, which is it doesn't want instability in North Korea. And so, in some ways, it can't figure out whether he helps or hurts that. The country is in another crisis economically. He even has had to make speeches to his people about that. And China does not want an unstable or a nuclear North Korea. Right. So that's been the basis for some shared interest going back, to the six-party talks around 2006 and the like. The reality of sanctions, which are authorized by the United Nations Security Council, is that North Korea has done lots of sanctions busting. Some has been with China, some has been with Russia, but a lot has been through cryptocurrencies and various kinds of black markets. So even if everybody stays committed to sanctions, the likelihood of that resolving the issue is not there. I think the crucial issue in North Korea, is going to be, when Trump and Kim Jong-un met, one of the issues was sequencing. How much sanctions do you lift? The same thing has been with Iran. For what concessions? And the notion that North Korea has to do total denuclearization before any sanction be lifted is just not going to work. Right, and then the other question is, what does denuclearization of the peninsula look like? Does it mean, the full peninsula, not just South Korea not getting nuclear weapons, but whether the U.S. would be able to bring, navally and otherwise, nuclear weapons in and out. So those are the crucial issues, and I do think there's a basis for shared interest. I think China, with some of the other issues in U.S.-China relations now, is using that a little bit as a lever, but fundamentally, I think we have a shared interest, and Russia too, in a degree of stability there, preferably with a leader that's not as terrible as Kim Jong-un, and it not being a nuclear state.
We've had another question about, and sort of discussing we mentioned before about sort of this anti-democratic tendency. Question has to do with, it says, according to the Nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute, millions of Americans are increasingly embracing anti-democratic opinions and openly contemplating political violence to defend their ideals. 1 in 3 Americans voting Republican agree that violence might be warranted to save the country, and 3 in 10 Americans believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Is democracy in danger in the US? Can Europe consider the US as a reliable partner if the Republican Party comes back to power in the 22 midterms and the 2024 presidential election?
On democracy in danger, absolutely, seguramente, for sure. And that's my concern, because this runs very deep. And there are indications. The Director of National Intelligence had said the greatest terrorism threat the United States faces is domestic, right? Not Islamic State or other. And these are groups that are well armed, that are determined. The notion that the big lie has gotten so much support is staggering. And again, there are problems, that we all have in our democracies right now, in Spain and elsewhere. But this is more extreme than our fellow democracies have. And so it is of great concern in a lot of ways. As to the midterms, typically an American president doesn't do well in midterms. George Bush did well in 2002 because the country was so, wrapped up in the immediate atmosphere after 9/11. But historically, it's been problematic. And this is the great debate going on in the Democratic Party on this. And, there is an argument that I happen to agree with, that Democrats win elections when they get things done. And Republicans win elections when they cut taxes and block things from being done. And that the prospects for the Democrats to do well in 2022, and there are a lot of Republican Senate seats, by the way, that are vulnerable from retirements and other sorts of things. So there is a possibility to hold the Senate and even do better. But frankly, I think it requires getting things passed in the Congress, the Build Back Better bills and other sorts of things that are being blocked now. Again, we have a crazy system now in the Senate where, you need 60 votes to get anything done to break the filibuster. And what democracy operates on the basis of supermajorities for daily business? Our Constitution requires 2/3 vote of the Senate for approval of a treaty and for a few other things, but they're very specific things. And the way the Senate's functioning, the Democratic Party, the notion that you get 60 votes, the filibuster, is a structural institutional problem that even if the Democrats get to 53 is still going to be there because all the Republicans oppose it. So we have some structural institutional issues that we really need to fix and are of great concern. And I'll only plug, a little bit of nepotism here, but there's a fabulous book on the filibuster, the title of which is called Kill Switch, and there's a subtitle after that that's been getting a lot of publicity in the United States. And that'd be written by a young man who has the same last name as me, and his name is Adam, and es mi hijo. So I'll do a little plug there. So.
Thanks for plugging that book. I'll definitely need to find that one. That's your son, I take it?
Yes, mi hijo, my son. That's right. Yeah.
We have a question from Sandra, who asks, in your opinion, what will be the best strategy for the U.S. to improve the migrant crisis in the border with Mexico, considering that it is impossible to process all the asylum applications, but then on the other hand, migrant flows continue and the situation in the border can be considered a humanitarian crisis?
It's a really good question, and I don't really have expertise on that. And I also will say, and maybe this differs from some colleagues, who are more liberal and Democrats. I think it's a very hard issue. I think the question of migration and security and the numbers of people that have come once Trump was done, on the one hand, you just can't allow that, sort of what happened to Merkel to a certain extent when she totally opened up so quickly in Germany to migration. It was well intended, but I think it had lots of consequences. You can go all the way back and talk about the roots of crisis, and some of those have to do with poverty, and some of those have to do with U.S. support for governments in Central America, not just Mexico, but Honduras and Guatemala and countries like that, where we've supported corrupt regimes because they were anti-communist or anti-terrorist, and they've made the lives that some people are fleeing political persecution, as well as poverty. So you've got to get at the roots of that, but it doesn't address the question in the immediate aspect. The inhumane treatment that the Trump administration did, the separation of children from their family, that can't happen. And to get immigration reform through the Congress, going back to 2006, George W. Bush actually tried to get immigration reform through the Congress then, And he had Democratic support and some Republican, but it was people in his own party even then that blocked it. So I don't have a good answer for that, but I don't think it's just to open the borders. I think that doesn't work in ways I think that we have to acknowledge at the same time we're trying to be humanitarian about the plight of the people that are coming.
Another question from Valeria. She asks, do you think that domestic developments in the U.S. in the last 4 years, and especially after the 6th of January and its aftermath, will erode U.S. global power and credibility in the long run? Also mentions, thank you for your insightful presentation and to the organizers for allowing participation to people outside the EU. Our pleasure.
Thank you, thank you. Yes to that. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, and I think that's what you get right now because it's become increasingly clear over 2021 that the deep systemic institutional threats to democracy have not gone away. We haven't even been able to get, the night of January 6th, people were hiding under their desks, Republicans as well. They were scared for their lives. And then these same members of Congress, of the House and the Senate, turn around and say, nothing to investigate here. I mean, that's pretty scary. It was their lives, many of them, that were being threatened. Vice President Pence, members of Congress. And that speaks to the depths of the problem. But even leaving that aside, my point there is this notion of the U.S. global role, a lot of what I was trying to emphasize, needs to change, period, because it was designed for a different era. And it doesn't provide, the same kind of benefits in this era that we're in now. And moreover, we tend to look back at the old era, I mentioned this a little bit, but just to add to it, with a little bit of, rose-colored glasses, as they say. I mean, as they said, if you contrast with the success of the U.S. and the Atlantic Alliance in Europe and containment and ultimately working with Gorbachev to end the Cold War and that Soviet threat, and then on strategic nuclear arms control, if you contrast that with U.S. policy in the so-called Third World, we never really understood Third World nationalism, whether it was in Central America or Southeast Asia or Africa, and we contributed to the problems. That era wasn't so great either. It was both positive and negative. And so, the notion that we had it right before, that's where we need to learn the right lessons from history. And it needs to change. The U.S. will always have, I think, or potentially be able to have the largest global role, the sheer size of our economy, many other aspects of our society. But it's not, it can't be the same role as it was before because of the ways that the world has changed. And there's a role, as I keep saying, for Europe, there's a role for China, there's a role for countries from other parts of the world as well, to a greater extent than there had been in the second half of the 20th century.
I was wondering if you could say something, sort of any thoughts that you have about Kamala Harris's foreign policy role. I mean, at the time of the election, I was convinced, operating from the assumption that Biden would not seek re-election, that Harris would be playing a much more prominent foreign policy role in order to bolster her credentials, but it doesn't seem like she's been that active. I was wondering your views about this.
Very interesting. There was an expression that goes back to one of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents who said the job was worth a bucket of spit. In other words, it didn't matter very much. The job had institutionally changed, and I will say that Al Gore, when he was Vice President Bill Clinton, was part of that change, because Clinton brought Gore on the ticket, frankly, for his foreign policy expertise broadly, which Clinton didn't have as a governor. And Vice President Gore had a role which wasn't just going to funerals or doing little things. Vice President Cheney had the same kind of role. Some people thought it was too much, and Vice President Biden did as well. There was a structural change in the role that vice presidents played that was beneficial, that they had, they were deputized to do a fair amount of things. And in each of those cases, I think it changed the institution. Pence and Trump was a different relationship. Kamala Harris, so far, has not had a role like Al Gore had for Clinton or Joe Biden had for Barack Obama. So she's gotten some very tough assignments to go down to the border or go to Latin American countries and say, don't come, that was not the right message. But American politics are like weather reports, not climate change. You know, things happen and the weather changes and the Kamala Harris political stock may go up over time. But so far, I think there's a sense that her vice presidency has not defined itself. And that remains to be seen. And if there is, you know, Joe Biden will be 82, I think, in 2024. If there is a primary, there will definitely be challengers. And where she fits in that, it's, you know, I think there'll be more attention to that after we get through the 2022 elections. One of the things she can do in 2022 is get out there and help Democratic candidates and get some IOUs. So watch for that as people start to run for Senate seats and the like. So, well, you know, remains to be seen. Right now, there's a lot of, you know, sense that it hasn't been defined, and I think that's a fair criticism. What are the defining issues? Biden in his first year was in charge of the economic recovery for Obama, and Gore had, you know, was really in the lead on some foreign policy issues, and she hasn't had that role yet. And why that is, you know, I think it'll change over time, and we'll see how successful it is.
If I could just bring you back to Afghanistan for a moment with sort of three interrelated questions. So if you go back to, I think it was April or whenever it was that Biden first gave his major speech on Afghanistan, essentially saying that he was be pulling out by 9/11. So the first bit of that is do you get a sense of that there's a public relations aspect to this presidency in the way it views foreign policy? For example, even on the democracy summit, you know, there was an earlier democracy summit in Denmark, I believe, which Biden did not attend, you know, maybe because, again, this is just my own view, not wanting to overshadow his own democracy summit later in the year. I mean, so that's the first thing is the extent to which this image mentality is still a driving factor. The second part is why, in your view, did the Biden administration not take more actions to at least slow the Taliban's advance down? I mean, sort of have this rapid advance, taking city after city, eventually Kabul. But there didn't seem to be any effort to at least try to slow them down using air power or something like this. You know, although they did bring in thousands of troops for the evacuation and so on. And the third bit is looking ahead. Do you think that the Biden administration will recognize the Taliban government, or, you know, will they be just supplying aid but no recognition? So I was wondering if you could give us a sort of forecast of where you see U.S.-Afghan relations going.
Yeah, boy, it's good questions. On the Democracy Summit, so folks can go, my colleague James Goldbauer and I wrote 2 articles in Foreign Affairs, one I think in November and then one in January after the January 6th about why we thought it was a bad idea. We're not anti-democracy, and we're about to write another that I'll send you. I think it's supposed to be in Politico next week, but we got to get it done. I just think it's a bad idea for a lot of reasons that I articulate there, including this, you know, if you invite some of these countries that aren't democracies, that are dinos, democracy in name only, you reinforce that notion that you've got, you know, you're not really taking the criteria seriously. And if you don't invite them, they end up getting angry at you, right? And there are a couple of other factors there. But on Afghanistan, so, you know, my view is, you know, to try to slow at this point, to try to slow the Taliban down, you had to make a major new commitment, right? And so you didn't have any middle ground here like you kept going to. You know, the whole history of the Afghanistan, I'd highly recommend. There's an article in War on the Rocks, which hopefully people subscribe to or can get through their libraries, last year or two by Barnett Rubin. And Barney Rubin was like one of the few scholars, he's a political science professor at Yale for years, who was paying attention to Afghanistan for anybody did. And then he worked the whole 25 years on the policy. He worked with Dick Holbrooke and others. And it's a really good analysis of where, for example, right after our first military effort in late 2001, the Taliban was willing to negotiate, and they were in a position of weakness, and there were missed out diplomatic opportunities there. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago in which I said we needed to get out, but we needed to not just get out, we needed to have a diplomatic, what I call the strategic diplomacy strategy. And that strategy had it to be, look, there are a whole lot of other countries that have interests at stake in Afghanistan, right? China does, Russia does, Iran does, India does, Pakistan does, Saudis do. And what we needed to do before we got so far down the road under Trump was to say, we're getting out, and you guys have all benefited behind our security blanket, playing around with your favorite parties while we've been trying to provide security. we all need to have some rules of the road here and some collective. This was the kind of thing that Kissinger did well, right? Did in the Middle East. We need to have some rules of the road here on everybody's, sort of second choice options here, so that there's a way of getting out that avoids the worst case outcome. And while China and Russia have been trying to find common ground with Taliban, even they are having mistakes. So one mistake was knowing what we didn't want to do, not what we wanted to do. And this was still doable in the Biden administration. Second was, where was the UNHCR? Why didn't we work with the UN High Commission on Refugees as we started to get out with the expertise and the resources and, frankly, some collective responsibility for the withdrawal and the threat to refugees? No effort was made there. Plenty of ability to know that before the fact, and a variety of other things that could have been done beforehand. I think Biden was so committed to getting out that that's what they thought of. But there was a way of handling getting out that could contribute to stability greater. There was a role for the United Nations to play there, as it has in so many other crises. And if Russia and China made that harder, it would have been clear that they bear some of the responsibility, but there were ways to work around it. You didn't need a Security Council resolution. You had some existing. So those are kind of my comments. We should have gone out a long time ago. It was the right decision, but very, very poorly implemented. And there have been consequences for it that will be with us for a while.
Look, as it's now 6 p.m. here, and I know that Professor Jentleson has to go off and teach a class in a few minutes, I'm afraid I will need to bring this session to a close. Professor Jentleson, thank you so much for your excellent and wide-ranging discussion of Biden's first year, or at least the first 10 months, and looking beyond as well. Trying to encapsulate the essence of the content of the Biden administration's foreign policy, especially when dealing with so many different topics, as well as debates about the policy process and so on, and fitting this into a short presentation, it's an incredibly difficult task, which you made to look remarkably manageable to do, and to do with flying colors. So in that sense, you set the bar very high. So thank you very much, indeed.
Thank you.
Before leaving, I would like to briefly remind everyone that next week we will actually have 2 sessions. On Tuesday the 9th, we will have Professor Philip McGowan, who heads the European Association of American Studies, speaking on 7 decades of American studies in Europe. And then on Thursday the 11th, we'll have Professor Sarah Snyder speaking on U.S. human rights policy. So I look forward to seeing you then, and wishing all of you a very pleasant remainder of the week. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Hasta luego. Ciao.